A flashing siren in the dead of night, a badge worn like a weapon, when a power-hungry officer pulled over a quiet, unassuming black woman on a lonely stretch of highway, he thought she was just another easy target to bully. To prove his dominance, he laughed, looked her in the eye, and tore her driver's license to pieces. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't know who she was, and he had no idea she was the federal judge presiding over his upcoming career-ending trial. The rhythmic hum of tires on wet asphalt was the only sound inside the cabin of the charcoal gray Lexus. Behind the wheel sat Elena Voss, a woman whose posture remained impeccably straight even after a long, grueling day. She possessed a quiet, commanding presence. Her dark skin caught the intermittent glow of the passing streetlights, and her sharp, perceptive eyes remained locked on the winding expanse of the highway. She was exhausted. For weeks, she had been buried under a mountain of injunctions, civil rights disputes, and corporate fraud dockets. Tonight, all she wanted was the sanctuary of her home, a cup of chamomile tea, and the absolute silence of her study. The highway was notoriously desolate at this hour. It was a narrow, tree-lined corridor that served as a physical divide between the bustling, diverse metropolis of the inner city and the wealthy, fiercely gated enclaves of the northern suburbs. Elena had driven this route countless times. She knew the speed limit dropped from 55 to 45 just past the Old County Bridge, and as a woman who had dedicated her entire life to the letter of the law, her speedometer hovered exactly at the posted limit. Then the darkness shattered. A blinding burst of blue and red lights erupted in her rearview mirror. The sudden illumination cast violent, erratic shadows across the interior of her car. Elena glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly. She checked her speed. She checked her dashboard. No lights, no issues. Her tags were freshly renewed. There was absolutely no probable cause for a traffic stop. But Elena was a realist. She had lived in America long enough to know that sometimes the only probable cause required was the color of the hands gripping the steering wheel. She engaged her turn signal, smoothly guiding her vehicle onto the gravel shoulder. She shifted into park, turned off the engine, and immediately engaged in the precise, rehearsed choreography that every person of color knows by heart. She turned on the interior dome light. She rolled her window completely down. She placed both hands flat at the top of the steering wheel, right at 10 and 2, ensuring they were entirely visible. In her side mirror, she watched the patrol car's door swing open. Officer Harlan Crow stepped out into the misty night air. Crow was heavily built with a tight buzz cut and a jawline set in a permanent, aggressive clench. He walked with a swaggering, heavy-heeled gait, the kind of walk practiced by men who view the world not as a community to protect, but as a territory to dominate. He unclipped his heavy mag-light flashlight, slapping it rhythmically against his palm as he approached. As he reached the rear of her Lexus, Crow deliberately pressed his thumb against her trunk. A standard tactic to leave a fingerprint in case the officer was harmed, but he did it with enough force to rock the vehicle. Elena took a slow, measured breath. Crow stopped just behind her driver's side door, maintaining a tactical position out of her direct line of sight. He clicked on the blinding beam of his flashlight and thrust it straight into the cabin, sweeping it aggressively over the pristine leather seats, the center console, and finally directly into Elena's eyes. She blinked, turning her head slightly away from the blinding glare, but her hands never left the wheel. "Do you know how fast you were going, ma'am?" Crow barked. His voice was loud, grating, and dripping with an unearned authority. "Good evening, officer," Elena replied. Her voice was smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. It was the voice of a woman accustomed to speaking into microphones in rooms where hundreds of people hung on her every syllable. "I was traveling at the posted limit." Crow scoffed, a short, ugly sound. He lowered the flashlight just enough so Elena could see his face. His eyes were narrowed, raking over her conservative navy blazer, her pearl earrings, and then taking in the expensive interior of the car. It was clear the mental math in his head wasn't adding up to the narrative he preferred. "You were doing well over the limit," Crow lied, his tone flat and uncompromising. "I clocked you back at the overpass." Elena knew instantly what this was. She had presided over dozens of civil rights cases involving predatory traffic enforcement. The overpass was miles back. If he had clocked her there, he wouldn't have waited until the most unlit, isolated stretch of the road to initiate the stop. He was fishing. "I assure you, officer, my cruise control was set," Elena said calmly, but if your equipment indicated otherwise, I will gladly accept the citation." Her composure seemed to irritate him. He stepped closer, leaning into the open window, bringing with him the faint smell of stale coffee and cheap aftershave. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Crow demanded, snapping his fingers impatiently, "and don't make any sudden moves." "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat," Elena narrated smoothly, looking straight ahead. "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for my purse first." "Just get it," he snapped, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his sidearm. Elena slowly reached over, retrieving her leather wallet. She extracted her state driver's license, her current insurance card, and leaned over to pop the glove box for her registration. She gathered the documents and handed them through the window. Crow snatched them from her hand. He held the license up to the beam of his flashlight, his lips moving silently as he read. Elena Voss, Oakwood Drive, Crestwood Hills. He lowered the card, staring at her. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Crestwood Hills was one of the most exclusive, affluent neighborhoods in the state. It was home to tech CEOs, surgeons, and high-powered legal minds. It was overwhelmingly white and notoriously gated. Crestwood Hills, Crow sneered, his voice dropping its pseudo-professionalism and adopting a mocking drawl. Is that right? That is my legal residence, yes, Elena replied, her tone remaining completely neutral. Whose car is this? He asked, tapping the registration against his chin. As you can see on the registration officer, the vehicle is registered to me. Crow leaned in closer, his face inches from the glass. You expect me to believe you own a car like this and live in an estate in Crestwood? What do you do for a living, Elena? He purposely dropped the ma'am, using her first name to establish dominance. Elena's eyes hardened, just a fraction. In her courtroom, lawyers were held in contempt for a fraction of this disrespect, but here on a dark road with a man holding a gun and a badge, she knew the rules of engagement were drastically different. I work for the federal government, Elena said evenly. It was the truth, albeit a modest abbreviation. Crow let out a bark of laughter. Oh, the government. What, you sort mail at the post office, or do you clean the offices after hours? The racism wasn't just bubbling under the surface anymore, it had breached the water and was standing in plain sight. Elena felt the familiar cold sting of bigotry, a ghost she had fought her entire career still haunting the present. But she didn't rise to the bait, she simply looked at him, her silence heavy and absolute. I asked you a question, Crow growled, his ego bruised by her refusal to cower. You asked me if I worked for the Postal Service or as a custodian, Elena replied. I answered with my silence, as the question is completely irrelevant to this traffic stop. If you are writing me a citation for speeding, please do so. If not, am I free to go? Crow's face flushed a deep mottled red. No one spoke to him this way, especially not out here on his stretch of road. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and dangerous. Officer Crow stepped back from the window, his chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked at the driver's license in his hand, then back to the immaculate woman sitting behind the wheel. The sheer audacity of her sitting there unfazed, refusing to play the role of the intimidated civilian, enraged him. To Crow, the badge on his chest wasn't just a symbol of law enforcement. It was a pass to absolute authority. He had built a reputation in his precinct as a hard charger, a euphemism used by his equally prejudiced peers to describe a man who routinely bent the Constitution until it snapped, particularly when dealing with minorities. You think you're smart, don't you? Crow said, his voice dropping to a menacing rasp. You think you can come through my town, drive a stolen car with fake documents, and give me attitude? Elena finally turned her head to look at him directly. Officer, you and I both know this car is not stolen. You have run my plates. You have my legitimate state-issued identification. You are deliberately escalating this encounter. I am respectfully requesting that you issue the ticket or return my documents. Fake identification, Crow corrected, a sinister smile spreading across his face. Excuse me? I said this is a fake ID. Crow held up the plastic card. The hologram is off. The font is wrong. You probably bought this on the street to match the registration in the glove box. Elena's pulse quickened, but she forced her heart rate to steady. She was dealing with a rogue actor, a man high on his own adrenaline and unchecked power. Officer Crow, she said, reading his name tag clearly. That is a valid driver's license. If you tamper with it, you will be violating several departmental policies and state laws. Oh, I'm violating policies? Crow laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He stepped fully into the light of the dome lamp, ensuring she could see what he was about to do. Let me tell you what we do with forged documents in my jurisdiction, Elena. With a sudden violent motion, Crow gripped the top and bottom of her driver's license. He twisted his wrist sharply. The thick plastic of the ID card bent, strained, and then let out a loud, sharp snap. Elena watched, her face a mask of stone, as the officer deliberately tore her state-issued identification completely in half. But he didn't stop there. He placed the two halves together and tore them again, his thick fingers straining against the material until the card was reduced to 4 jagged pieces. He tossed the mutilated pieces of plastic through the open window. They fluttered down, landing on Elena's lap and the pristine center console. Oops, Crow sneered. Looks like your fake ID was defective. Broke right in my hands. Elena looked down at the pieces. The barcode was severed. Her face was torn in two. Slowly, she picked up a piece that bore the state seal. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't scramble out of the car or reach for her phone in a panic. Instead, her legal mind went to work, filing away every detail: the time, the location, the lighting, the exact phrasing of his threats, the aggressive body language, and the destruction of personal property. "You have just destroyed my property," Elena stated, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying calm of a hurricane's eye. "I confiscated and disposed of fraudulent contraband," Crow countered, leaning his forearms against the roof of her car, completely relaxed now that he felt he had asserted his dominance. "Now, since you no longer have a valid license, you can't drive this vehicle. I should impound it. I should rip you out of that seat, put you in cuffs, and let you spend the weekend holding to the bars and lockup until we figure out whose car this really is." He paused, waiting for her to beg. He wanted the apology. He wanted her to shake, to plead, to call him sir. Elena simply stared at him. She saw right through the bravado. She saw a small, insecure man compensating for his profound inadequacies by terrorizing citizens in the dark. "But I'm in a good mood tonight," Crow continued, clearly disappointed by her lack of visible terror. He pulled a thick citation book from his back pocket and aggressively scribbled across the carbon paper. He ripped the yellow copy from the pad and shoved it through the window, letting it flutter down onto the torn pieces of her license. "Driving without a valid license, speeding, failure to obey an officer. You have a mandatory court appearance in a few weeks," Crow said, stepping back from the car. "I suggest you don't miss it. If you do, I'll come to Crestwood Hills and arrest you myself. Call a tow truck. If I see this car moving tonight, I'm taking you to jail." With that, Crow turned his back on her, swaggering back to his cruiser. He climbed in, killed the overhead lights, and left his headlights shining brightly into her rearview mirror, waiting for her to make a move. Elena sat in the quiet cabin of her Lexus. She picked up the yellow citation. She read the scrolled handwriting. Officer T. Crow, badge number 4492. She reached into her purse, bypassed the pocket where she kept her judicial credentials, which she could have easily flashed to end this entire ordeal, but chose not to, because no citizen should have to be a judge to be treated with basic human dignity, and pulled out her cell phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Sergeant Grant, Highway Patrol," the voice answered. "Marcus, it's Elena," she said quietly. "Elena, it's past midnight. Is everything all right?" "I am currently pulled over on the shoulder of Route 114, about a mile north of the county line. I need you to send a patrol car to my location to escort me home." "Are you stranded? Car trouble?" "No," Elena replied, her eyes locked on the cruiser idling behind her. "I was just subjected to an illegal stop by a local municipal officer. He destroyed my driver's license, threatened me with arrest, and ordered me not to drive my vehicle. I need an official escort, and I need a formal incident report filed immediately upon your arrival." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Sergeant Grant knew exactly who Elena Voss was. They had worked together for years before she was appointed to the federal bench. "Give me a few minutes, Judge. I'm coming myself." Elena ended the call. She gathered the torn pieces of her license, carefully placing them into a small zippered compartment in her purse. They were no longer just trash. They were evidence. Exhibit A. Later, the morning sun poured through the massive arched windows of the federal district courthouse downtown. It was a monolith of marble, mahogany, and absolute authority. This was not traffic court. This was not a municipal hearing where small-town cops traded favors with local magistrates. This was the federal level where careers were made and destroyed with the bang of a gavel. Officer Harlan Crow stood in the grand hallway outside courtroom 4B, adjusting the collar of his stiff dress uniform. He looked sharp, professional, and entirely unbothered. Next to him stood attorney Marcus Pierce, a slick, high-priced defense lawyer retained by the police union. "You look tense, Tommy. Relax," Pierce said, checking his gold watch. "I'm not tense, I'm annoyed," Crow grumbled, shifting his weight. "This whole thing is a circus. The ACLU gets involved and suddenly I'm a federal case. It was a standard apprehension." Crow wasn't here for a traffic ticket. He was here because the Department of Justice, prompted by an avalanche of civil complaints, had finally brought a massive Section 1983 civil rights lawsuit against him and the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department. He was accused of a prolonged pattern of racial profiling, unlawful detainment, excessive use of force, and destruction of civilian property. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," Pierce said dismissively, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his tailored suit. "They have statistics, sure. They have a few angry civilians, but they don't have hard, irrefutable evidence of malicious intent. It's mostly he said, she said." "What about the judge?" Crow asked, adjusting his utility belt. "You said we got a good draw." We got the best draw, Pierce grinned, leaning in conspiratorially. Judge E. Voss, appointed a few years ago. Impeccable record, she's a strict constitutionalist, doesn't tolerate emotional grandstanding in her courtroom. She deals in facts, evidence, and the letter of the law. As long as you sit there, look respectful, and stick to the narrative that you were acting reasonably within your duties, she'll likely dismiss the individual claims against you before this even gets to a jury. Crow smirked, a surge of arrogant confidence washing over him. Strict, huh? Good. I like a judge who respects law and order. Just remember you're coaching, Pierce warned lightly. Yes, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Do not lose your temper. Federal judges are literal gods in these courtrooms. You cross them, they can hold you in federal lockup for contempt without blinking. I know how to play the game, Rick. Let's just get this over with. The heavy oak doors to courtroom 4B swung open, and the bailiff stepped out nodding to Pierce. Counsel, we are ready for you. Crow and his attorney walked into the cavernous courtroom. It was intimidating by design. The ceilings were high, adorned with intricate woodwork. The spectator gallery was packed. Reporters, civil rights advocates, and several civilians who had filed complaints against Crow. He ignored them all, walking with his chest puffed out, taking his seat at the defense table. At the plaintiff's table sat a team of federal prosecutors and civil rights attorneys. They looked quiet, confident. Crow scoffed internally. Let them try. All rise! The bailiff's voice boomed, echoing off the marble walls. The entire courtroom stood in unison. The United States District Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Elena Voss presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court. Crow stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead at the American flag positioned behind the bench, projecting the image of a stoic, dedicated public servant. He heard the rustle of black silk robes as the judge ascended the steps to the bench. She took her seat in the high-backed leather chair, arranging her files. Be seated. A calm, resonant, and terribly familiar voice echoed through the courtroom's microphone system. Crow sat down, pulling his chair to the table. He finally looked up at the bench. The air in Crow's lungs vanished. His heart performed a violent, sickening lurch, slamming against his ribs. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a pale, ashen gray. His hands resting on the mahogany table began to tremble uncontrollably. Sitting above him, looking down through a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, was the woman from Route 114. It was her, the exact same woman. The dark skin, the sharp, perceptive eyes, the unwavering, regal posture. She wasn't wearing a navy blazer anymore. She was wearing the black robes of a United States federal judge. Judge Elena Voss looked out over the courtroom, her expression entirely unreadable. She didn't glare, she didn't smirk, she simply projected absolute, terrifying authority. Good morning, counsel, Judge Voss said, her voice smooth and professional. We are here today regarding docket number 4B, the United States versus Officer Harlan Crow in the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department. Crow couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. He vividly remembered the dark highway. He remembered leaning into her window. He remembered his own mocking voice. What do you do for a living, Elena? You sort mail at the post office? Or do you clean the offices after hours? He remembered the sickening snap of the plastic as he tore her driver's license in half and threw it in her face. Your Honor, the lead federal prosecutor stood up. The government is prepared to present opening arguments outlining a systemic, documented pattern of constitutional violations by the defendant. Thank you, Counselor, Judge Voss replied. She then slowly turned her gaze toward the defense table, her eyes locked directly onto Officer Harlan Crow. For several seconds, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. In that brief span of time, Crow saw it in her eyes. She remembered every single second. She remembered the disrespect, the abuse of power, the illegal destruction of her property. And now he was sitting in her kingdom, and she held his entire life in the palm of her hand. Mr. Pierce? Judge Voss said, addressing Crow's attorney but keeping her eyes fixed on the terrified cop. I have reviewed the preliminary evidence submitted by the prosecution, including Exhibit A, which was submitted late last night. Pierce stood looking confused. Exhibit A, Your Honor, the defense has not been made aware of any new physical evidence. Judge Voss reached into her desk drawer. It was processed through the federal evidentiary system this morning. Counselor, a copy is being provided to your table now. A clerk walked over to the defense table and placed a clear plastic evidence bag in front of Crow and his attorney. Inside the bag were 4 jagged pieces of a torn driver's license. Pierce looked at it, completely bewildered. Your Honor, what is this? Crow stared at the bag. He felt bile rising in his throat. His entire career, his pension, his freedom, it was all disintegrating before his eyes. That, Mr. Pierce, Judge Voss said, her voice echoing with the crushing weight of absolute justice, is a masterclass in the abuse of power, and we are going to spend a very, very long time discussing it. Attorney Pierce stared at the clear plastic bag resting on the polished mahogany table. He reached out with a manicured hand, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion, and slid the bag closer. He peered through the thick plastic at the 4 jagged, mutilated pieces of a state-issued driver's license. He could see the top half of a photograph, a woman with dark skin and a calm, unyielding expression. He saw the state seal violently severed down the middle, and then his eyes drifted to the printed name, pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle of doom, Elena Voss. Pierce froze. The breath completely left his lungs. Slowly, mechanically, he lifted his head and looked at the woman sitting high upon the judge's bench. The face on the torn card and the face looking down at him from the seat of ultimate federal authority were identical. "Tommy," Pierce whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant slickness. He didn't take his eyes off the judge. "Tommy, what did you do?" Next to him, Officer Harlan Crow was experiencing a physiological meltdown. His heart rate had skyrocketed to a dangerous tempo, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat broke out across his forehead, slick and cold. The stiff collar of his dress uniform suddenly felt like a hangman's noose, choking the air from his throat. He tried to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but his mouth was bone dry. All that came out was a pathetic, raspy squeak. He remembered the night on Route 114 with terrifying clarity. He remembered his own mocking voice echoing in the dark. "What do you do for a living, Elena? You sort mail at the post office? Or do you clean the offices after hours?" He had torn up the driver's license of a sitting United States federal judge. The murmurs in the courtroom began to swell. The reporters in the gallery, sensing a seismic shift in the atmosphere, leaned forward, their pens flying across their notepads. The DOJ prosecutors at the plaintiff's table sat perfectly still, an air of quiet, lethal confidence radiating from their lead attorney, Lena Holt. Pierce snapped into survival mode. He shot up from his chair, nearly knocking it over. "Your Honor, the defense objects to this entire proceeding. This is a blatant ambush. Furthermore, if the court is implying what I believe it is implying, there is a catastrophic conflict of interest here. We move for an immediate mistrial and a formal recusal of the bench." Judge Voss did not raise her voice. She didn't strike her gavel. She simply folded her hands atop her files and looked at the panicked defense attorney. "Mr. Pierce, your motion for recusal is entirely appropriate," Judge Voss said, her voice echoing smoothly through the microphone. "In fact, it is mandated under Title 28 of the United States Code, Section 455, and Canon 3C of the Code of Conduct for United States Judges. A judge shall disqualify herself in any proceeding in which her impartiality might reasonably be questioned, or where she has personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts concerning the proceeding." Pierce blinked, slightly thrown off balance by her immediate agreement. "Then you are stepping down from this case?" "I am," Judge Voss confirmed. She looked directly at Crow, pinning him to his chair with a stare that felt like physical weight. "I cannot preside over a trial assessing the defendant's pattern of racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and destruction of civilian property, because less than a month ago I was a victim of it." A collective gasp ripped through the spectator gallery. The reporters furiously tapped on their laptops. The union representative sitting in the second row dropped his head into his hands. "However, Mr. Pierce," Judge Voss continued, her voice slicing through the noise like a scalpel, "I am not dismissing this case, and I am not throwing out this trial. I have already filed the necessary paperwork with the appellate circuit." She turned her head slightly toward the heavy oak doors leading to the judge's chambers. "Bailiff, please open the doors." The courtroom fell dead silent as the doors swung open. Stepping into the room was Chief Judge Marcus Harlan. Harlan was a legend in the federal circuit, a stern, uncompromising jurist known for handing down maximum sentences to corrupt public officials. He walked up the steps to the bench with a heavy, deliberate tread. Judge Voss stood up. She unclasped the front of her black silk robe. In one fluid motion, she let the garment slip from her shoulders, draping it over the back of her leather chair. Beneath it, she wore a sharp-tailored slate gray suit. She was no longer the presiding judge. She walked down the steps from the bench, crossing the well of the courtroom, and stepped directly into the witness box. Chief Judge Harlan took her seat at the bench, adjusted his microphone, and banged the gavel once. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "The court will note the formal recusal of Judge Elena Voss," Chief Judge Harlan growled, his voice a deep, resonant bass. "This trial will proceed without delay. The Department of Justice has added a superseding charge of deprivation of rights under color of law and destruction of evidence. The prosecution may call its first witness." Lead prosecutor Lena Holt stood up, a tight, merciless smile on her face. "The United States calls Elena Voss to the stand." At the defense table, Crow closed his eyes. The nightmare hadn't ended. It was only just beginning. The swearing in of Elena Voss was a surreal moment. The court clerk held out the Bible, and Elena placed her right hand upon it, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As she took her seat in the witness box, she adjusted the microphone, looking perfectly composed. She was in her element. She had spent decades in courtrooms just like this one, and she knew exactly how to dismantle a lie. Lena Holt approached the podium. "Good morning, Judge Voss. For the record, please state your current occupation." "I am a United States District Judge for the federal court," Elena replied clearly. "Judge Voss, I want to direct your attention to the night of the incident. Can you tell the court where you were at approximately that hour?" "I was driving home from this courthouse, traveling northbound on Route 114 in my personal vehicle, a 2024 Lexus LS. Holt paced slowly in front of the jury box. "Did anything unusual happen on that drive?" "Yes, I was subjected to a traffic stop by Officer Harlan Crow of the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department." "Were you violating any traffic laws, Judge Voss?" "I was not. My cruise control was set to the posted limit in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. My vehicle was fully registered, insured, and functioning properly." Holt turned to look at the defense table. Pierce was furiously scribbling notes, looking for any angle to attack her credibility. Crow was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with the woman on the stand. "Judge Voss, I am holding the official police report filed by Officer Crow on the night in question," Holt said, holding up a piece of paper. "In it, he states, and I quote, 'The suspect was belligerent, refused commands, and presented a damaged, heavily taped, and suspected fraudulent identification card. He also noted that his body-worn camera malfunctioned during the stop and his cruiser's dash cam was inadvertently switched off. Is his account accurate?'" "It is a complete fabrication," Elena stated flatly. "I was fully compliant. I presented a pristine, valid state-issued driver's license. Officer Crow then mocked my neighborhood, questioned my ability to afford my vehicle, explicitly accused me of stealing it, and then intentionally tore my driver's license into 4 pieces with his bare hands." Pierce practically leapt out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely hearsay. The officer's report stands as the official record. The prosecution is relying on uncorroborated testimony because, as noted, there is no police video of the incident." Chief Judge Harlan looked down at Pierce over his reading glasses. "Counselor, the witness is providing sworn testimony of her own experience. Overruled. You may sit down." Holt smiled. "Actually, Your Honor, Mr. Pierce brings up an excellent point regarding video evidence. Officer Crow was quite confident that because his cameras were conveniently malfunctioning, there would be no record of his actions." Holt turned back to Elena. "Judge Voss, earlier you mentioned the specific make and model of your vehicle, a 2024 Lexus LS. Does that vehicle come equipped with any specific security features?" Elena allowed a small, sharp smile to touch her lips. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster moving a piece into checkmate. "Yes, it does. The 2024 Lexus LS is equipped with the Inform 360-degree surround vision system. It utilizes 4 high-definition exterior cameras and an interior cabin microphone to record all interactions around the vehicle for security purposes. The data is continuously uploaded and encrypted on a secure cloud server the moment the vehicle is put into park." At the defense table, Crow's head snapped up. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth fell open in silent, sheer terror. Pierce dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Furthermore," Elena continued, her voice echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom, "because Route 114 is heavily wooded, Officer Crow deliberately pulled me over just before the illuminated security gates of the Crestwood Hills residential entrance. I have already subpoenaed the 4K security footage from the Homeowners Association." "Your Honor," Holt said, turning to Chief Judge Harlan, "the prosecution would like to submit Exhibit B, the synchronized video and audio recordings from both the vehicle's telematics system and the Crestwood Hills security cameras." "Admitted," Harlan said, his eyes narrowing at Crow. "Play the video." The large flat-screen monitors mounted across the courtroom flickered to life. The entire room held its breath. The screen split into 2 angles. The left side showed the high-resolution wide-angle view from the neighborhood security camera, perfectly capturing Crow's cruiser, illuminating the charcoal gray Lexus. The right side showed the view from the Lexus's side mirror camera pointing directly at the driver's side window. The audio kicked in, crystal clear. "Do you know how fast you were going, ma'am?" Crow's aggressive voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as Elena calmly handed over her pristine documents. They watched Crow snatch them. They watched him lean in, his body language dripping with menace. And then the audio played the words that would end Harlan Crow's life as he knew it. "You expect me to believe you own a car like this and live in an estate in Crestwood? What do you do for a living, Elena? You sort mail at the post office, or do you clean the offices after hours?" Gasps echoed from this gallery. The raw, unfiltered bigotry was no longer an allegation. It was a digital reality being broadcast in federal court. The video continued. The camera caught the exact moment Crow grabbed the top and bottom of the driver's license. The interior cabin microphone picked up the loud, violent snap of the thick plastic breaking. "Oops!" Crow's sneering voice echoed in the silent courtroom. "Looks like your fake ID was defective. Broke right in my hands." The video showed Crow tossing the pieces onto Elena's lap, threatening to drag her out of the car, and swaggering back to his cruiser. The screens faded to black. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a man's career, reputation, and freedom being incinerated in real time. Pierce slowly sat back in his chair. He didn't look at Crow. He reached over, closed his legal pad, and pushed his chair an inch away from his client. In the legal world, it was the physical manifestation of abandonment. There was no defense for this. There was no spin. It was an execution. Lena Holt stood quietly at the podium, letting the weight of the evidence crush whatever defiance was left in the room. "Judge Voss," Holt said softly, did you eventually make it home that night?" "I did," Elena replied, her gaze fixed on the broken man at the defense table. "Only after waiting for a state highway patrol supervisor to arrive, document the destruction of my property, and escort me to my driveway. Because, as Officer Crow promised me, if I had attempted to drive my own vehicle without the license he had just destroyed, he would have dragged me out and locked me in a cage." Chief Judge Harlan leaned forward over the bench, his face a mask of furious, righteous anger. He looked directly down at Harlan Crow, who was now weeping silently, his face buried in his hands. "Mr. Pierce," Harlan's voice rumbled like thunder, "does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness?" Chief Judge Harlan's voice hung in the cavernous space of courtroom 4B, heavy and uncompromising. He peered over his reading glasses, staring directly at the slick, high-priced defense attorney. "Mr. Pierce?" Harlan repeated, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like a physical pressure. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness?" Richard Pierce did not stand. He did not button his tailored suit jacket or project the arrogant confidence he had carried into the courtroom just an hour earlier. Instead, he slowly looked down at his legal pad. It was completely blank. He looked at the clear plastic evidence bag containing the mutilated driver's license. Then he glanced up at the frozen high-definition image of his client's sneering face on the massive courtroom monitors. Pierce swallowed hard. In his decades of practicing law, he had defended unsavory characters, corrupt officials, and guilty men. But he had never in his entire career been trapped in a room where the victim, the star witness, and the original presiding federal judge were the exact same person. It was an inescapable, catastrophic checkmate. "No, Your Honor," Pierce finally rasped, his voice devoid of all its former theatrics. "The defense has no questions for this witness." Next to him, Officer Harlan Crow snapped out of his catatonic state of shock. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized his features. He grabbed Pierce's forearm, his thick fingers digging into the expensive wool of the attorney's suit. "What are you doing?" Crow hissed, his voice trembling with terror. "You have to do something. Object. Call for a mistrial. You can't just leave me hanging here." Pierce forcefully ripped his arm out of Crow's grip. He didn't bother to lower his voice. "I am doing something, Tommy. I am saving my own law license. You lied to me. You lied on a federal affidavit. You committed perjury, destruction of evidence, and a blatant civil rights violation against a sitting United States judge. I cannot defend you without suborning perjury myself. It is over." Crow's breathing became ragged, shallow gasps. The walls of the marble courtroom felt like they were closing in on him. He looked out into the gallery. The reporters were staring at him with undisguised contempt. The civil rights advocates who had fought for years to expose him were practically vibrating with vindication. Desperation makes men do foolish things. Ignoring all courtroom protocol, Crow shot up from his chair, his hands planted flat on the mahogany table. "Your Honor, please," Crow pleaded, looking frantically between Chief Judge Harlan and Elena Voss, who still sat poised in the witness box. "Please, I need to speak. I need to explain." "Mr. Crow, you are out of order," Chief Judge Harlan warned, his hand resting on his gavel. "Your attorney has declined to cross-examine, unless you are formally taking the stand, which I highly advise against. Given the incontrovertible video evidence of your perjury, you will sit down and remain silent." "I just want to apologize," Crow cried out, his voice cracking. The bravado, the swagger, the cruel sneer he wore on Route 114 had entirely evaporated, replaced by the pathetic whining of a bully finally backed into a corner. He turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward Elena. "Judge Voss, please. I am so sorry. I was having a terrible night. The stress of the job, the late hours, it got to me. I made a horrible mistake. I swear to God, I didn't know who you were. If I had known you were a federal judge, I never would have treated you that way. You have to believe me." The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the scratching of the reporter's pen ceased. All eyes turned to the witness box. Elena Voss did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, bringing her face closer to the microphone. When she spoke, her words were delivered with a cold, surgical precision that cut straight to the bone of Crow's defense. "That is precisely the point, Mr. Crow," Elena said, her resonant voice echoing off the high ceilings. Crow blinked, tears spilling over his eyelashes. "What?" Your apology is entirely meaningless, Elena continued, her dark eyes locking onto his soul, because you are not apologizing for your actions. You are apologizing because of your audience. You are sorry because you got caught, and you are sorry because of my title. She gestured gracefully toward the video monitors. You just admitted your core failure in open court. If I had known you were a federal judge, Mr. Crow, it shouldn't matter if I am a federal judge, a postal worker, or a custodian. The Constitution of the United States does not scale its protections based on a citizen's tax bracket or their zip code. The rights you violated that night belong to every single person in this country unconditionally. She paused, letting the profound weight of her words settle over the room. When you looked at me on that dark highway, Elena said softly, you didn't see a judge, but more importantly, you didn't see a human being. You saw a target. You saw someone you believe possessed no power, no voice, and no recourse. You thought you could tear up my identity, threaten my freedom, and leave me stranded in the dark simply because you held a badge and a gun. You are begging for mercy now because the power dynamic has shifted. But justice is not about power, Mr. Crow. It is about accountability, and your accountability has finally arrived. Crow collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had been kicked out from under him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent, pathetic sobs. The prosecution rests, Your Honor, lead prosecutor Lena Holt announced, a triumphant, steely edge to her voice. Chief Judge Harlan nodded. He looked at the defense table. Mr. Pierce, does the defense intend to call any witnesses? Do you intend to present a case? Pierce stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. He looked down at his client, shaking his head in disgust. No, Your Honor, the defense rests. Because Crow and his union attorneys had brazenly opted for a bench trial, arrogantly believing that Judge Voss would side with a fellow officer of the law and dismiss the case on procedural grounds before a jury could hear it, there was no jury to deliberate. The absolute authority to determine Harlan Crow's fate rested solely in the hands of Chief Judge Marcus Harlan. Harlan did not even call for a recess. He did not need to retreat to his chambers to review the law or ponder the evidence. The case was the most spectacularly catastrophic display of police misconduct and perjury he had witnessed in his decades on the federal bench. He closed his leather-bound binder and looked out over the courtroom. Officer Crow, stand up, Harlan ordered. It took Crow a moment to comply. He rose to his feet on trembling legs. He looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. The crisp dress uniform he wore now looked like a costume he had no right to wear. Harlan Crow, Harlan began, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble. You were entrusted with the incredible power and responsibility of enforcing the laws of this state and this nation. Instead of acting as a shield for the public, you chose to operate as a predator. You engaged in a documented, systemic pattern of racial profiling, intimidation, and unlawful detainment. Harlan picked up the police report Crow had filed. He held it up by two fingers as if it were diseased. You sat in your cruiser and you fabricated a sworn government document. You lied about the speed of the victim's vehicle. You lied about her demeanor. You destroyed state property. And then you walked into a United States federal court and attempted to use those lies to defend yourself against civil rights charges. Your arrogance is matched only by your profound incompetence. Harlan dropped the paper. He reached for his wooden gavel. I find the defendant Harlan Crow liable on all civil counts of constitutional violations under Section 1983. Furthermore, based on the incontrovertible evidence presented today, this court finds you guilty of the superseding criminal charges, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, destruction of evidence, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1621, perjury. The finality of the words echoed like a death knell. Crow swayed on his feet, gripping the table to keep from falling. For these crimes against the public trust, Harlan continued, I am sentencing you to a term of decades in a federal penitentiary. In the federal system, Mr. Crow, there is no early parole. You will serve every single day of that sentence. Upon your release, you are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity anywhere in the United States. Your pension is hereby forfeited, and the Municipal Police Union is ordered to pay full restitution to the plaintiffs of this civil suit. Crow let out a strangled, breathless sound. Decades in federal prison for a former cop who was famous for abusing minorities. It was a terrifying, almost unthinkable reality for him. United States Marshals, Harlan barked, looking toward the back of the courtroom. Take the defendant into federal custody, now! Two towering U.S. Marshals stepped out from the shadows near the gallery doors. They walked briskly down the center aisle, their heavy boots echoing on the marble floor. They flanked Crow at the defense table. Hands behind your back, the taller Marshal ordered, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Crow slowly brought his hands behind him. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as the heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The sharp click, click, click of the locking mechanism echoed through the room. It was the exact sound Crow had threatened Elena with on that dark, lonely highway. Now it was the sound of his own ruin. As the marshals turned him around to lead him out of the courtroom, Crow cast one final desperate look toward the witness box. Elena Voss was not looking at him. She had already moved on. She stood up from the witness chair, smoothing the fabric of her slate gray suit. She walked gracefully across the well of the courtroom, completely ignoring the weeping, handcuffed man being dragged past her. She approached the back of her high leather chair at the judge's bench. She picked up the heavy black silk robe she had left draped over the seat. With a practiced, elegant motion, she swung it around her shoulders and fastened the front, stepping back into the mantle of her authority. She was no longer just a victim on the side of a road. She was the embodiment of the law. "Court is adjourned," Chief Judge Harlan announced, striking his gavel against the sounding block with a definitive, explosive crack. The doors to the courtroom swung shut, sealing Harlan Crow's fate forever. If your jaw dropped at this incredible moment of instant karma, hit that like button and share this story with someone who loves seeing justice served. Power-hungry bullies always think they're untouchable until they mess with the wrong person. It proves that no matter who you are, accountability will always catch up to you in the end. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on these epic real-life stories of poetic justice. Drop a comment below. Did the judge give him what he deserved? See you in the next one.